Today, we're going to be talking about the history of violence and war.
And we're going to start with the idea that violence has actually decreased significantly throughout history. It's a core argument in Steven Pinker's book, The Better Angels of Our Nature. Pinker argues that a lot of it has to do with the rise of what he calls the Leviathan. It's basically a strong central authority that can enforce laws and maintain order. By creating a system of laws and punishments, states take on that responsibility of maintaining order, which frees individuals from the burden of constantly having to defend themselves.
Okay, so states emerge and things start to get a little more civilized,
Yeah,
at least when it comes to violence.
right.
But what happened next in this journey toward a less violent world?
Believe it or not, even something as seemingly trivial as table manners played a role.
Wait, table manners. You're telling me that knowing which fork to use helped reduce violence.
It might sound strange, but there's this theory called the civilizing process that explains this connection. Starting in the Middle Ages, European societies began to develop more refined codes of conduct, like behaviors that were once considered perfectly acceptable, like spitting on the floor or resorting to violence. The slightest provocation gradually became taboo.
So it's like society collectively decides to be a little more polite.
Yeah, it's a shift in what's considered acceptable behavior.
Somehow this led to less violence.
Exactly, and it wasn't just about etiquette. This shift in manners reflected a deeper change in attitudes towards violence itself. It became associated with the lower classes with barbarity,
Right.
while self-control and restraint were seen as markers of status and refinement.
So it's fascinating how something as simple as table manners can be a reflection of bigger societal changes.
It really is.
So we've got states providing order, manners, taming our wilder impulses. What other ingredients went into Pinker's recipe for a less violent world?
There's another factor that might surprise you. Commerce.
Commerce.
Yeah, the idea being that trading with other countries is usually more profitable than invading them.
So it's less appealing to go to war.
Yeah, exactly. And it's like that old saying, make money, not war.
But before we get too sidetracked, you mentioned something else that contributes to a less violent society, and it sounds honestly intriguing. The rise of the novel.
This is one of my favorite parts of Pinker's argument. He suggests that novels, by allowing us to step into the shoes of characters that are different from ourselves, can foster empathy and broaden our circles of concern. When you immerse yourself in a well-written story, you're exposed to different perspectives, different experiences,
Right.
different ways of seeing the world. This can challenge your preconceived notions and make you more understanding of people who are different from you.
It's like expanding your emotional intelligence by tapping into the experiences of others.
And Pinker argues that this increased empathy, fostered in part by the rise of the novel, has contributed to a decline in violence not just toward other people, but even towards animals.
It's a fascinating idea. It's a good reminder that these seemingly unrelated cultural shifts
Yeah.
can have ripple effects
Yeah, absolutely.
in unexpected areas like violence.
Absolutely.
Speaking of violence, I'm curious to know how this long-term decline you've been describing squares with the world today, because we see wars on the news all the time, so it certainly doesn't feel like we're living in an era of peace.
You're right. And that's where our discussion needs to shift from the broad sweep of history to a more focused look at recent trends in warfare. Because while we might be less violent overall, the nature of conflict has changed in some significant ways.
So what you're saying is, while humanity might be getting better at avoiding these big knockdown, drag-out wars between countries, we're still struggling with other forms of violence.
That's one way to put it.
Okay.
We've seen a dramatic decrease in interstate wars,
Okay.
but civil wars, conflicts within a single country,
Right.
have become much more common in the post-World War II era.
Okay, so fewer battles between countries, but more battles within them. That's a pretty big change.
It is.
So what's driving this rise in civil wars? Like, what are the factors at play there?
One key factor is the collapse of empires and the subsequent creation of new states.
Right.
Think about it. When a large empire breaks apart, it often leads to a power vacuum, which can create instability and open the door to violence.
It's like that old saying, nature abhors a vacuum. When a powerful force disappears, something else is going to rush in to fill the void. And that something else isn't always peaceful.
And we've seen this pattern play out repeatedly throughout history. For example, the collapse of the Ottoman Empire after World War I
Right.
led to a series of conflicts in the Middle East
Right.
as different groups competed for power and territory.
Are there other factors that make a country more prone to this type of conflict?
Absolutely. Political scientists have identified a whole range of variables that seem to increase the risk of civil war.
Hmm.
One of the most significant is poverty.
Okay.
Poorer countries tend to be more susceptible to internal conflict.
Makes sense. If you're struggling just to survive, you might be more willing to take risks, even dangerous ones, just for the hope of something better.
Yeah, and poverty erodes trust in institutions,
Mm-hmm.
creates ground for resentment,
Right.
and makes it easier for rebel groups to recruit new members. If someone's already facing hardship, the promise of change,
Right.
even through violence, poverty can create a sense of desperation that makes people more vulnerable to recruitment.
What else is on the list?
The terrain of a country can play a surprisingly significant role. Almost all civil wars are fought in the countryside, not in major cities. It's interesting, right? You would think that cities would be more strategically important. But for insurgent groups, the countryside offers some crucial advantages.
Mountainous terrain or like dense forests, those would be ideal for hiding out.
Exactly. Mountains, jungles, remote rural areas. These are the places where insurgents can operate with relative impunity, making it harder for government forces to track them down and defeat them.
It makes you wonder how the geography of a conflict zone affects the strategies that both sides use. It's got to be a lot harder to win a civil war if the rebels can just melt away into the mountains every time the army gets close.
You're absolutely right.
Yeah.
Terrain can be a major factor in determining the outcome of a conflict.
Are there any other red flags that might indicate a country is at higher risk for civil war?
One more that's particularly relevant to the world today is the age structure of a country's population.
Okay.
Specifically, the proportion of young men. Young men are often the ones who are most disenfranchised, most likely to be unemployed, and most susceptible to recruitment by armed groups.
Because if you're a young man with limited opportunities, joining a rebel group might seem like a way to gain power or status or even just a sense of purpose.
Exactly.
Even if it means resorting to violence.
And when a country has a large youth bulge, meaning a significant percentage of the population is between the ages of 15 and 30, the risk of civil war increases dramatically.
So a combination of poverty, lack of opportunity, and a large group of young men with not much to lose, that can create a perfect storm for conflict. Are there any factors that might make a country more resistant to civil war?
A strong state with a well-established presence throughout its territory and a monopoly on the use of force is generally less likely to experience civil war.
So it's like Hobbes' Leviathan again, right?
Precisely.
A powerful central authority that can enforce the law and deter potential challengers.
Exactly. But when a state is weak, especially in its peripheral areas, it creates opportunities for insurgents to operate and potentially gain control.
A newly formed state, for example, with a weak central government, would be at higher risk of civil war than a more established state with a strong military and police force.
That's a key finding that emerges from some of the most influential research on the causes of civil war. There's a landmark study by James Fearon and David Letton. They analyzed data from over 200 countries over a period of 50 years, found that poverty and mountainous terrain were two of the most important predictors of civil war.
That aligns with what we've been discussing.
Exactly. Interestingly, they didn't find that the presence of lootable resources was a significant predictor on its own. They didn't find that democracies were significantly less likely to experience civil war than authoritarian regimes. It turns out that the relationship between regime type and civil war is more nuanced than that. In fact, some scholars argue that transitional democracies, countries that are in the process of moving from authoritarianism to democracy, might actually be at a higher risk of civil war. And it brings us back to the idea of anarchy that we discussed earlier. Remember Pinker's argument that anarchy is a breeding ground for violence?
Yeah.
A weak or transitional state can create a kind of internal anarchy.
So let's dig into why these civil wars have become so prevalent. And it seems like one major factor is just the changing global landscape, like the collapse of empires, especially in the 20th century. It's a fundamental reshaping of the power dynamics.
Exactly. And often the new states that emerge from these broken empires are dealing with a whole host of challenges, weak institutions, economic instability, simmering ethnic or religious tensions.
So where do we go from here? Like, how do we translate these insights into action?
There's no single ideology or intervention that will magically solve the problem of violence. There are countless individuals and organizations working tirelessly to promote peace and to address the root causes of conflict.
So what can we as individuals do to contribute to this effort?
I think it starts with education
Okay.
and awareness. The more we understand about the complexities of conflict, the better equipped we'll be to engage in meaningful conversations and support constructive solutions.
So it's about informed action.
Yeah.
Not just reacting emotionally to the latest headline.
Exactly. We can also support organizations that are working on the ground in conflict zones,
Okay.
advocate for policies that promote peace and development, and challenge the narratives
Right.
that perpetuate violence and division.